Thank you for your interest in watching or listening to this sermon preached at North Point Baptist Church. Our hope is that our preaching ministry serves you well. We do, however, wish to strongly discourage you from using this or any other of our sermons as your primary means of spiritual nourishment. We urge that you would seek this spiritual nourishment in the context of our local church, under the care of pastors and members who know and love you. May our contribution to your spiritual life in this sermon be only a small supplement to the ministry at your local church. Blessings in Christ. The elders of North Point Baptist Church, Nairobi.
Well, let me invite your attention now to the book of Mark, chapter 15. Mark chapter 15. We are approaching the end of our journey in this book. With only 3 more sermons to go. Or 4. 3. The 4th one will be a Christmas sermon, but 3 sermons in Mark. This morning will be in verse 1 to verse 20. Mark chapter 15 from verse 1 to verse 20. Let me ask if you're able to, that you would stand for the reading of God's word. I'm reading from the English Standard Version. And as soon as it was morning, the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and the scribes and the whole council. And they bound Jesus and led him away and delivered him over to Pilate. And Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And he answered him, "You have said so." And the chief priests accused him of many things. And Pilate again asked him, "Have you no answer to make? See how many charges they bring against you." But Jesus made no further answer, so that Pilate was amazed. Now at the feast he used to release for them one prisoner for whom they asked. And among the rebels in prison who had committed murder in the insurrection, there was a man called Barabbas. And the crowd came up and began to ask Pilate to do as he usually did for them. And he answered them, saying, "Do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews?" For he perceived that it was out of envy that the chief priests had delivered him up. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have him release for them Barabbas instead. And Pilate again said to them, "Then what shall I do with the man you call the king of the Jews?" And they cried out again, "Crucify him." And Pilate said to them, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Crucify him." So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released for them Barabbas. And having scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. And the soldiers led him away inside the palace, that is the governor's headquarters, and they called together the whole battalion. And they clothed him in a purple cloak, and twisting together a crown of thorns, they put it on him. And they began to salute him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they were striking his head with a reed and spitting on him and kneeling down in homage to him. And when they had mocked him, they stripped him of the purple cloak and put his own clothes on him. And they led him out to crucify him. And this is the word of the Lord. Praise be to God indeed. So the title of our message this morning is The Unwanted King. The Unwanted King. Those of you who follow business will know the familiar story of how certain investors, venture capitalists and such, how sometimes they will overlook and maybe even despise a particular business idea because it seemed like nothing when it was first brought to them. And then later, the story goes that idea becomes a global phenomenon. It becomes a huge success. Think of the regret of the company that used to sell videotapes when they were offered a chance to invest in a new platform called Netflix. And they said no. What those kinds of stories teach us is that sometimes things that seem like nothing and are thus cast aside can turn to be absolute game changers. In the passage we come to this morning, a powerful Roman official, Pilate, comes face to face with a person who seems like an absolute nobody. This official, Pilate, will go ahead to despise. He will go ahead to cast this person away. He will not stop to give any thought to the fact that maybe there is more to this Jesus than meets the eye. Pilate will see more value in the desire, the wishes of a crowd than in the claim that Jesus is king. Now, this theme of Jesus as king has picked up steam, you will remember, in chapter 11 of the book of Mark. There in chapter 11, you will remember that Jesus enacted a triumphal entry, a royal entry into Jerusalem, riding on a donkey. You remember we learned that he did this to fulfill Zechariah 9:9, the prophecy that calls for Zion to rejoice because her king comes riding humbly on a colt. This kingship theme of Jesus becomes even more clear in the trial before the Sanhedrin, the Jewish ruling council that had been trying Jesus all night. You remember there that Jesus, this is from last week's sermon, Jesus claimed that he would sit at the right hand of God's throne and he would come with the clouds of heaven. Both those statements were taken from two Old Testament passages, Psalm 110, Daniel 7:13, which speak of the enthronement of the Messiah as God's king, who would one day possess universal rule. Now the theme of Jesus as king takes center stage. It is this theme that frames the whole thrust of our passage. In our passage, Jesus will be mockingly called King of the Jews 4 times. 3 times it will be said by Pilate himself, and once it is said by Pilate's soldiers. The readers of the book of Mark, who lived long after Jesus' resurrection and ascension, as they read this, they would immediately recognize the absolute irony of the enemies of Jesus insulting Jesus with his actual identity. They thought nothing of him who was everything. Therefore, our argument this morning is as follows. Jesus is the king that no sinner wants, that every sinner needs. Jesus is the king that no sinner wants, that every sinner needs. We'll break that argument out into 3 points, which I trust to show from our passage. Number 1, Jesus the King. Number 2, Jesus the unwanted King. And number 3, Jesus the King every sinner needs. Jesus the King, Jesus the unwanted King, Jesus, the King, every sinner needs. Number one, Jesus, the King. So it is morning after a sleepless and grueling night of trial. The Sanhedrin had already condemned Jesus as worthy of death. However, they don't have the legal power to actually execute him. That power had been stripped from them because they were under Roman occupation. So only the Roman governor had the power to declare execution. So in verse 1, they hold an early morning consultation. Mark says that it is as soon as it was morning. He says as soon as it was morning because he wants to underscore the eagerness with which they want to get this done. As soon as it was morning, they hold a consultation. They hold a briefing. They want to prepare a package for the Roman governor. After they hold their consultation, we are told that they bound Jesus. Perhaps with ropes, maybe with chains, we don't know. This binding is mostly for show, more than it is a necessity. They all knew that Jesus was not a flight risk. But they really want to play up an image of Jesus as a dangerous criminal. This especially since they need to convince the Roman governor that Jesus needs to be executed. So verse 1 concludes that they led him away and delivered him over to Pilate. Jesus had prophesied that the Jews would hand him over to the Gentiles. And here we see that being fulfilled. Pilate is the governor that Rome had sent to oversee and to manage the Judean region. He doesn't live in Jerusalem. He lives in a region called Caesarea. But he comes to Jerusalem during the period of the Passover feast because of the thousands upon thousands of pilgrims who have come to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover. This always heightened the danger of Jewish uprisings against Rome. And so he comes, he brings a contingent of soldiers. He wants to maintain the peace. When Jesus is handed over, delivered over, brought to Pilate, Pilate held court in the morning. This is when he pronounced all of his judgments. We learn an interesting fact, that the Sanhedrin, who sent the chief priest to be their primary spokesman, they had modified their charge against him. So observe verse 2. And Pilate asked him, so this is after he has listened to the chief priests. He now asks Jesus, are you the king of the Jews? And he, Jesus, answered him, you have said so. The charge presented is that Jesus was claiming to be the king of the Jews. The implication of the charge being that he was therefore threatening an overthrow of Caesar as king. Now, at the trial before the Sanhedrin, last week's sermon, the passage before this, you will remember that they had accused him of blasphemy. And they had condemned him to death for blasphemy. But now they adjust their charge from blasphemy to treason. This is very cunning. They know that if they present blasphemy as a charge, that's a religious charge, it's a theological charge, Pilate will not care about that charge at all. He'll see that as a scuffle among you Jews. That's a local issue. Go deal with it yourselves. The Romans were not polygamists, polytheists. Polytheists. They worshipped many gods, Caesar being one of them. And so this idea of blasphemy would not have carried much master with Pilate. But the charge of treason, the charge that there is someone claiming that they are king, now Pilate has to deal with that because that touches on the authority of Caesar as king. So this is why Pilate asked Jesus the question, are you the king of the Jews? Now, Jesus' answer can be puzzling to us who don't speak like this. We are not Semitic people. He says, you have said so. And as Kenyans, when we read that, we feel like Jesus is denying that he is a king of the Jews. You know, Kenya would understand this answer as Jesus saying, I never said I was. You are the one who is saying that, not me. This is how Kenyans conduct themselves. Now, this is not what is going on. Jesus is actually saying yes. He's saying yes. But he's saying yes with a kind of a caveat. He's saying basically this, yes, it is as you say, but there is more to the story than you realize. I am the king of the Jews in a manner of speaking. In speaking like this, Jesus is likely hinting at the fact that though he is the king of the Jews, his kingship is of a different kind, as we have been seeing from chapter 11. It's not concerned with the earthly politics of Rome. It's concerned with the heavenly politics of God. It is concerned with the kingdom of heaven. This is the shape we have seen that his kingdom has taken since chapter 11. It is a spiritual, it is a meek, it is humble, and it is a heavenly kingdom. So yes, he is the king of the Jews, but in a very different sense than these chief priests are proclaiming to Pilate. So Jesus here owns the fact that he is a king. He reveals who he is. But notice that he reveals who he is when it is most unbelievable. He reveals who he is when it is least likely to lead to temptation for him. He reveals who he is when he is bound. He is tired from a sleepless night of interrogation. His followers have all scattered. From a human point of view, Pilate has all the power and Jesus has none. One could not walk into this judgment hall and conclude that Jesus is a king. Pilate is the one who is like a king in this scenario, wielding the power of Caesar. And yet here, in this pitiful, pathetic state, Jesus plainly admits that he is the king of the Jews. Consider how Jesus will not force people to believe in him. The same one who shone with glory on the mountain could end it all right here by doing the same thing. However, in utter weakness, with chains on his hands, he bears witness to being the king. This is the way of Christianity. Clothed in meekness, we speak the truth about Jesus and leave the outcomes to God. We do not rely on shows of power or glory or brilliance. We tell people what seems utterly unbelievable to them, that they are not the ultimate kings of their lives. Jesus is. We tell them, even people in power, people with wealth, people who feel invincible because of their power and their wealth, we tell them that they do not hold the fate of Christianity in their hands. They are not king. Jesus is. Now, the way the narrative proceeds tells us that Pilate does not believe this claim. And he must have signaled to the chief priest that he was not particularly impressed. This bound man who has eye bags, you're presenting this guy as a threat to Caesar? He is the king of the Jews? Pilate was super unimpressed. Just a power dynamic in the room was just not playing up to the charges of the chief priest. So he must have signaled this to the chief priest. And this is why we get verse 3. So look at verse 3. And the chief priest accused him of many things. So they pile up new accusations. They multiply accusations against Jesus. They exposit and pull out of this charge implications for Pilate. They are seeing Pilate is not getting impressed, so they come up with many things. If you consider the other narratives in Luke or in John, they talk about Jesus saying people should not pay taxes. He said they shouldn't pay taxes to Caesar. They come up with stuff. Jesus who said, give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar. They just lie. Many things, Mark says. They're doing this to convince Pilate that Jesus should be killed. They have been given a charge from the consultation by the Sanhedrin in verse 1 to get this done. Get it done. And so they get to work. Many charges. As one chief priest is coming up with charges, the other one is thinking up others. He steps aside and this one comes and they are making an argument for why Jesus should be killed. Now verse 4 reads like deja vu. If you were here last week. Because verse 4 is a near exact repeat of the question that the high priest asked Jesus in chapter 14 verse 60. So look at verse 4. Pilate to Jesus, have you no answer to make? See how many charges they bring against you. That's exactly what the chief priest said to him. And once again, the exact same thing happens. Jesus remained silent. Verse 5. He made no further answer. It's like Jesus is saying, I have said all that needs to be said. I am the King of the Jews. I have nothing else to add. In verse 5, it ends by telling us that Pilate is amazed, with almost a tinge of admiration. That word amazed has a tinge of admiration. He's amazed by this silence of Jesus. Whoever saw a defendant who refuses to defend themselves? Whoever saw a lamb that remained silent before a butcher approaching with a knife? It's like he wants to die or something. It's like he has some invisible program that he's following that none of us are able to see. Oh, and it's true. Jesus indeed does have an invisible program he's following. You remember in Gethsemane, he knelt before his Father and he settled the issue. He would face the hour and he would drink the cup. And so he makes no defense. He gives no answer to the charges. He lets it happen. They spew their charges. And Jesus stays completely mum. You know, in the book of Leviticus chapter 16 verse 21, during the famous Day of Atonement, the priest would lay hands on a goat and the priest would confess the sins of the people over that goat before sending it off to the wilderness to die. There, the sin of the people would be symbolically imputed on that animal by the priests. Perhaps here Mark is giving us a faint picture of Jesus being treated like that scapegoat. The crimes being said of Jesus are crimes that he never committed. However, these crimes had most likely been committed by others. In fact, it is certain, as we will see, that the charges being laid on Jesus were true of another man in the passage called Barabbas. Does Jesus remain silent because he understands himself to be the sacrificial animal that symbolically takes on himself the sins of the people? He never said, don't pay taxes. But the insurrectionists said, don't pay taxes. Are these priests unwittingly fulfilling here an Old Testament practice? Could it also be that Jesus did not defend himself so that by his death he could defend us? Could it be that he remained silent so that his blood could speak for us? What a wonderful thing to consider that we Christians bow to a king who died for us, his subjects. Now, at the end of our passage, on the other side of the passage, after Jesus is condemned by Pilate, we get a mock coronation by Pilate's soldiers. And there again, the theme of Jesus as king features in an ironic way. The theme of Jesus as king comes up in their mistreatment of him. So look at verse 16. Verse 16. And the soldiers led him away inside the palace, that is the governor's headquarters, and they called together the whole battalion. Jesus at this point was fully in the hands of these Gentiles. He is taken into the governor's palace, and then we are told that all the soldiers are called together. The whole battalion comes. This assembled battalion could have been anywhere between 200 to 600 men. The more important question is not how many were they. The more important question is, why are they assembled? Why are they called together? Why do they come and ecclesia, church, assemble? Well, because they want to play act the coronation of a king. For their amusement, they pretend to be his subjects. A great king needs a large number of citizens, so they call the whole battalion together. This kind of impulse to mock Christ lies deep in the heart of those who will not bow to him as king. We saw something like that at the recently held Olympics, when they held a mock enactment of the Last Supper. Some of you will know it caused a global outcry. There are children in the room, so I cannot say more about that mock disdain of Christ and Christianity. Are you here and you're not a Christian and there is disdain in your heart against King Jesus? In verse 17, they put a purple cloak on his back. His back at this point was shredded from the flogging he had just received. The purple cloak is meant to be a symbol of royal dignity. Purple being a royal color in that world. And then they also fashion a crown, not made with gold, but with thorns. It is a cruel and sadistic act where they inflict pain by jabbing the head of Jesus with thorns, whilst also achieving the visual spectacle of crowning him as king. The ceremony continues in verse 18 with mock salutes. They come and they bow before him and they say, "Hail, King of the Jews." What they do mockingly is an enactment of what was actually taking place. They don't realize it, but King Jesus was on the path of being enthroned. Pilate and his sadistic soldiers are fulfilling the conditions for Jesus to enter into his royal glory. Oh, that the enemies of Christ would realize that they cannot outwit God. The hour of their cruelty is also the hour of his crowning. They fulfill that which they seek to destroy. It is why Paul says in 1 Corinthians, if the rulers of this age knew what they were doing, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. Are you here this morning and you feel yourself to be in the hands of evil men? Do not despair. All they can accomplish is what God has ordained, and no more. Jesus was to acquire his messianic glory through suffering and death. Thus, Mark mingles suffering and glory in this image of a king robed and crowned and surrounded by loyal subjects. Even though the crown is made of thorns and the robe is cheap and the subjects are pretending. Dear saint, have you accepted that the path of suffering is the path of glory? Have you accepted that? Have you bought into that truth? This is the heart of our faith. No glory without suffering. How is the kingdom of Jesus to unfold? It unfolds through weakness. It unfolds through the cross. Peter, who is likely the source material for Mark's gospel, would later say in his epistle, chapter 2, he says that Jesus suffered in this way as an example for us. When we find ourselves despised and reviled by men, we too are to bear our suffering with Christ-like dignity, with Christ-like meekness. We are to know that in our weakness, we are being crowned with glory. Paul the apostle said the same thing. He said that this light and momentary affliction is presently working for us. Whilst it is happening, it is working for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. Here in Jesus' suffering, we are given an ironic image of glory even in the midst of suffering. What they mock as pathetic and ridiculous turned out to be the truest thing ever. Jesus is King. However, in our passage, we also note that he is the unwanted King, which is our second point. The unwanted King. At the very bowels of this passage is the rejection of Jesus. This is the main point of this passage. The rejection of Jesus. It's the climax of the passage. This rejection is made even more vivid because he is rejected in favor of another man. Mark unfolds this in the middle of the passage. In verse 6, we are informed, which is a kind of setting, we're informed that Pilate's annual practice was to release a prisoner to the Jews during the Passover feast. He did this to please them, in order to help maintain a peaceful coexistence with the Jews. The Jews had a tendency to rebel against Rome. That was one of those things they just did every so often. And so Pilate is a true politician. He relies not only on force. You read in the book of Luke how he mingled the sacrifices with the blood of some people that he had killed in the temple. So he's a ruthless man who uses force, but he also uses favors. And it is with this background that we are introduced to this fellow, Barabbas. So look at verse 7. And among the rebels in prison who had committed murder in the insurrection, there was a man called Barabbas. You remember in chapter 14, Mark described the lavish sacrifice of the unnamed woman who came with the alabaster box. He's doing the same thing with Barabbas. He's sort of posing and giving us a couple of details about Barabbas. He describes him as a rebel against Rome, Roman occupation. He describes him as a murderer. And he describes him as an insurrectionist. So Barabbas is a man who hated the Roman government so much, he participated, probably led, organized rebellion against the Roman government, and he had personally killed, not through some others, he had personally killed in service of this political belief. Do you see the irony here? Barabbas is in reality who Jesus is being accused of being potentially. Barabbas is not a potential threat to the authority of Caesar. He is an actual threat to Rome. Barabbas has actually shed blood in rebellion against Rome. Jesus has not. Nor has Jesus given any sign or any signal of being like Barabbas. And so when the Jewish crowd comes to ask for their usual favor, and this crowd is comprised primarily of residents of Jerusalem, sometimes we get a confusion about the crowds. Earlier the crowds were saying, they were hailing him as king, and then later they're saying crucify him. And is it the same crowd? Probably not. The crowd that was hailing Jesus was the pilgrims who come to Jerusalem for the festival. And likely this crowd is residents of Jerusalem, part of the Jerusalem establishment. So they come, and they come to ask for their usual annual favor. Release for us one of us. Mark wants his readers and us to have Barabbas' character in mind. So look then at verse 8 and verse 9. And the crowd came up and began to ask Pilate to do as he usually did for them. And he answered them, saying, "Do you want me to release for you the King of the Jews?" The crowd, it seems, comes without any particular person in mind. There would have been multiple Jews in prison for various crimes, some of them more prominent than others. As we will see, Barabbas seems to be a particularly prominent insurrectionist. Pilate sees in the crowd's request an opportunity to release Jesus. Pilate is not convinced that Jesus is a threat, and he's now looking for an opportunity to release Jesus without getting trouble on himself from the Sanhedrin. So the chief priests had not succeeded in convincing him concerning any guilt on Jesus' part. In fact, in verse 10, look at verse 10. We are told there that Pilate perceived that it was out of envy that the chief priests were delivering Jesus up to him. They were being driven by envy. Jesus is more popular than them, and they don't like it. Consider how powerful a motivator envy and jealousy is. All this pretended righteous indignation against this King of the Jews who needs to be killed, all of it is a lie. It's envy. It's all a facade. It's all a smokescreen. It's all hiding one green monster. Envy and jealousy. Are you envious of someone this morning? How might envy be causing you to behave unjustly and unrighteously towards others? Beware of the corrosion of envy. Believe with all of your heart that God is good to you, even if he has given someone else something that you want. There is enough goodness in God for all of us. Remind yourself. Say that to your soul. Every time the corrosion of envy shows up in your heart, there is enough goodness in God for all of us. Saints, if we let envy reign in our church will wilt and wither and become a place filled with hypocrisy and unrighteousness. May God spare us from this blight. Because Pilate sees no danger against Rome from Jesus, he asks in verse 9, if he should release him to them, should I release to you the King of the Jews? Now, at this point, you have to see the blood draining from the faces of the chief priests. Because their whole plan to get Jesus executed is about to collapse. If the crowd says yes, it would all be over. Pilate had just put the final decision in the hands of this crowd. They put the decision on him. He's not convinced. And now he kicks the can down the road to the crowd. Do I release this guy? And so there ensues a desperate campaign by the chief priest to get Jesus killed and to get Barabbas released. So look at it in verse 11. But the chief priest stirred up the crowd. They stirred up the crowd to have him release for them Barabbas instead. Notice that it is the chief priests that bring up Barabbas. They stir up the crowd to ask for him instead of Jesus. So Barabbas is likely prominent and beloved by the Jews who did not like Rome and did not like the Roman occupation of Israel. And so they bring up Barabbas as an option, as an enticement to the crowd. Wouldn't you rather have him? Wouldn't you rather have the one who actually is fighting for you and for your freedom? And not this king who comes riding on a donkey? Wouldn't you rather have Barabbas? And the crowd is like, Good point. Yeah, actually, when you put, Barabbas is actually better for our nation. We want Barabbas. Now let's think about how corrupt these chief priests have to be. They now have to speak out of both sides of their mouth. The reasons they give to Pilate for Jesus' death are likely the same reasons they give to the crowd for Barabbas' freedom. I'll say that again. The reasons they give to Pilate for Jesus' death are likely the same reasons they give to the crowd for Barabbas' freedom. Think about it. To Pilate, they had argued something like, Jesus' claim to be king makes him a danger to the Roman government, and thus he must be killed. And then to the crowd, they go over and they argue that Barabbas, the actual danger against the Romans, must be released. Talking out of two sides of their mouth. They are pragmatists. They will do whatever it takes to get it done. They will lie to get it done, which is how Satan operates. One person has observed that to Adam and Eve, Satan says, God is not being good enough to you. He is holding something back from you. And then to God, Satan says about Job, you have been too good to him. You have been too good to him. It's because you have blessed him too much. That's why he loves you. So to us, he says, God isn't good enough. And to God, he says, you've been too good to them. And to Pilate, they say, kill him because he's a threat. To the crowd, they say, release him because he's a threat. My non-Christian friend, what arguments have you come up with in order to rid yourself of Jesus? Have you found yourself justifying the unjustifiable just so that you can see Jesus and his kingdom lose? That's not a winning strategy. It may pay off in the short term, but in the end, you lose. You can't beat God. Saints, do you find yourself becoming a hypocrite? Because you simply don't want Jesus to be king in some sphere of your life? Do you find yourself saying one thing to one group and another thing to another group in the church in a bid to justify keeping Jesus out of some place in your life? You just don't want to bow to him in that area. And so you become completely hypocritical. What people think of you on this side of the church and what they think of you on this other side of the church is completely different because you're lying. How sneaky our hearts can be when we are gripped with a rejection of Jesus, even if it's a partial rejection of Jesus in some area of our life. If we will not bow to him fully, we will contort ourselves like these chief priests. We will tell half-truths just in order to keep Jesus out. This is how passionately the chief priests do not want Jesus. And they succeed in convincing the crowd to ask for Barabbas instead. And so the desires of the chief priests, now voiced by the desire of the crowd, carries the day. And so look at the exchange in verse 12 to 14. And Pilate again said to them, then what shall I do with the man you call the King of the Jews? And they cried out again, crucify him. And Pilate said to them, why? What evil has he done? But they shouted all the more, crucify him. This crucify him is more, get rid of him so that we can have Barabbas. The chief priests, it seems, have also coached the crowd on what to say about the fate of King Jesus. Crucify him. Now, crucifixion is the punishment that Rome had reserved for its worst criminals. People like Barabbas. This is why Pilate asks, what evil has he done? It's a reaction to crucifixion. Why? What evil has he done? For crucifixion to be committed, there needed to be a high threshold, a crime of heinous proportions. Pilate even shifts the language from just crime to evil. What evil has he done? With Jesus, there was none to be found. With Barabbas, it was a specimen of evil. However, the crowd is mad with desire to have their freedom fighter released. And so they cry out all the more for this king to be crucified. And then in verse 15, after almost collapsing, we see the desire of the chief priest and the Sanhedrin fulfilled. Pilate crumbles and he hands Jesus over to death. Look at the tragedy of verse 15. So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released for them Barabbas. And having scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. Pilate has Jesus scourged and delivered to be crucified. This scourging or flogging would have happened in full view of the crowd. It would have involved two men flogging him in tandem on his bare back and his legs. They would have used leather-stringed whips which had bones and metal at the end of them. They would have been ripping into his flesh with every brutal lash and causing him great agony. Many victims usually died just from this scourging and never actually made it to the execution itself. Oh saints, are we in authority? Let us use it justly and not like Pilate. Let us use our authority in a way that blesses those under us. Parents, husbands, bosses, etc. Far be it from us that unfair politics and bending of justice happens under our leadership. North Point members, let us so live with one another that in our community everyone feels honored and fairly treated. Let it be that one's experience of our church's life is not like the experience of Jesus at the hands of the people in this passage. Let us value truth and righteousness. When we are called upon as a church to conduct church discipline, let us do so with all fairness, with all carefulness, with justice, with righteousness before God. Pilate, we are told, also has Barabbas released. The one who actually posed a threat to Rome is released, and the one who preached love for one's enemies is sent to suffer. The guilty is exchanged for the innocent. The guilty goes free, the innocent one goes to die. Here, despite the failure of Pilate, in God's sovereignty, we get a picture of the great gospel blessing. We, the guilty ones, we are the ones who committed actual treason, not against Caesar or Rome, but against the God of the universe. Our sin deserved judgment and death, and we stood condemned. And then Jesus stepped in and took our place. He suffered our death for crimes we had committed. He was exchanged with us, and we get to go free. His rejection was for our acceptance. He is a king who dies in the place of his subjects. This is why we will sing, in my place condemned he stood, sealed my pardon with his blood. Hallelujah. What a savior. If you're here and you're not a Christian, here is what Jesus offers you. He offers you an exchange. Let him be the one who dies in your place under the condemnation that is rightfully yours. You can go home free today, like Barabbas did, if you will turn and trust in Jesus. Jesus is finally confirmed for crucifixion. His enemies have succeeded in their plot to destroy him. And they all do so in a way that reveals exactly why Jesus had to die. They all do so in the way that reveals exactly why the Son of God had to come into the world. Why did God need to become a man? This passage is the evidence, which brings us to our final point. Jesus, the King, every sinner needs. When you read this narrative, you are struck by the fact that there is nothing redeeming about the people involved here. Absolutely nothing. Only Jesus is innocent. Everybody else is guilty. What we have in this passage is a melting pot of sinners. We first notice that what happens is a conspiracy. a coming together between Jews and Gentiles. People who are mortal enemies have now become friends around getting rid of Jesus. In verse 1, it is a Jewish Sanhedrin that consults in the morning and conspires to hand Jesus over. And then they hand him over to the Gentile governor Pilate. Jesus is then mistreated and mocked in verse 16 to 20 by Gentile soldiers. The crowd in verse 13 that cries out to crucify him is a Jewish crowd. In all these people, we have a representation of sinful humanity coming together to reject King Jesus. Theologically, there are only two kinds of people: Jews and Gentiles. Those who are among the people of God and those who are outside the people of God. All of them come together to kill Jesus. The people of God and the godless heathen, all at work in tandem to condemn and to kill an innocent man. And then look closely at the kinds of things they do. The Sanhedrin has to lie about the nature of Jesus' kingship to Pilate in order to paint him as a threat to Rome. There was nothing in how Jesus had conducted himself that even remotely suggested that he was interested in a revolution against Rome. The chief priests presented many false charges against Jesus. The chief priest in verse 11 had to stir up the crowd to have an actual criminal released. This act, we have seen, was steeped in rank hypocrisy, for they were demanding that the actual threat to Rome be set free in place of the meek teacher from Nazareth. The chief priest had descended to the position of liars and hypocrites and murderers. Barabbas is described as a complete rascal. He is not shy about killing and rebelling against the Romans. He's also a rebel. He's an insurrectionist. He's not a specimen of godliness in any measure. The soldiers in verse 16 to 20 spent a lot of time and energy creating a high degree of production. In Jesus' coronation, they sneer and mock and beat him. In verse 19, they strike him on the head with reeds. They spit on him before they lead him out to crucify him. They absolutely take delight in his suffering. They are sadist and cruel. And at the head of them all, the man who combines all of the evil in this passage is this governor called Pilate. So look again at the description in verse 15. So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released for them Barabbas, and having scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. The key phrase there is wishing to satisfy the crowd. Pilate is convinced that Jesus is innocent. He holds power to act with righteousness and justice. Instead, he wishes to satisfy the crowd. He chooses to abuse his power for the sake of popularity and peace. He can see that the chief priests are envious. He perceives it. And yet he still condemns an innocent man. He sees that the crowd has no answer to the question, what evil has he done? And yet he bends to their desire, knowing that it is an evil desire, knowing that it is an unrighteous desire, it is an immoral, unethical desire, and he bends to their desire. In this passage, we have a melting pot of the evil of the human heart. The Sanhedrin, the chief priest, Barabbas, the crowd, the soldiers, Pilate, they all engage in lies, envy, mockery, sadism, political pragmatism, murder, rebellion, hypocrisy. Rich men, poor men, powerful men, religious men, heathens, all come together to commit the most gross miscarriage of justice the world has ever known. I quoted R.C. Sproul to you last week. Why do bad things happen to good people? That only happened once, and he volunteered. At every turn, Mark provides no glimmer of righteousness. All we get are new depths of wickedness. Those who know the truth set it aside for selfish ends. Those who have power abuse it for selfish ends. Even the soldiers create a ceremony for their personal enjoyment at the expense of Jesus. The forces of darkness are made evident in the actions of all the people involved here. Here is where the sinful heart of man leads. Here is a picture of why Jesus had to come into the world. How does one fix this condition? How do you change this? How do you change hearts that produce this kind of horror show? How might man be changed so that this kind of thing does not happen? And the answer is the King of the Jews. The answer is Jesus. The answer is that man's heart must be changed and be brought to truly bow to King Jesus, which happens through his death on the cross. What the soldiers do in mockery, all men must do sincerely. It is only under King Jesus that perfect righteousness will dawn. And this is what will take place. He died, he rose, he ascended, and he is coming back. And oh saints, when he comes back, King Jesus will not lie when he comes to judge and to rule. He will rule with absolute justice. He will not need to conduct trials in secret and at night. Everything will be made plain. King Jesus will not play around with words when he declares his judgment. He will say that which is straight and true. King Jesus will not condemn anyone innocent, and he will not free anyone guilty. King Jesus will not submit to his judgment to the desires of any crowd, but he will judge with his own perfect wisdom and his own absolute knowledge. King Jesus will not be influenced by any outside forces to corrupt his judgment. It will be an absolutely pure judgment. So you either get with him now or you face it then. There will be no corruption then. There will be no miscarriage of justice then. It will absolutely righteous and pure. Saints, we have a king who will not fail us. We have a king who will satisfy every desire for true justice that lies within us. So do you feel like the courts of men have failed you? Do not despair. The court of King Jesus will soon be convened, and there, everything will be made right. The king, no sinner wanted, will be revealed to be the king that every sinner needed. Let's pray. Our holy God, we ask that you would cause all of us in every way to bow our knee to King Jesus. We ask that you would give hope to those who feel that they have been failed by the systems of justice of the world, that they would look forward to the pure and righteous justice that Jesus will bring. We pray for those who have yet to bow to Jesus. They continue to rebel against him. Oh Lord, would you give them new hearts? Would you cause them to see him dying on the cross and dying for them to be saved? Would you help them to turn